In the interest of time, I'll just start talking while everyone gets settled. Hello, everybody. My name's Keely Kovacevic. I work at MLA in the adoption team under Sally. As part of my role in the team, I get to look after the livestock advisor upskilling programs. So I remember in 2019 when this program first started, I was working as Mick Crowley's EA, and I actually booked him a ticket to come along to the first one, and I was so jealous I wanted to go along. Later that year, I actually started managing this program, and because COVID and all of the other things that have happened in between, this is the first one I've ever actually attended. So I'm very happy to be here, and I'm very happy to see all of you. And thank you very much for coming and being so engaged, and looking forward to the next few sessions of the day, and then also our networking drinks afterwards, which I have also been told there will be canapes provided, which I'm very much looking forward to. So I'm very excited to introduce Bob Shepard. Bob has been in the industry for 46 years, and he is the Principal Extension Officer of the Grazing Land Management team with DAF. Today, Bob is here to share some opportunities to drive the long-term sustainability of beef production through improved grazing land management. So thank you so much, Bob.
Thanks very much, Keely. Where's my gizmo? Here we go. So you might be asking yourself, what is this beef industry trifecta? Of course, you don't need to be Albert Einstein to work it out. But anyway, I'll talk about that in a minute. What I'm going to cover in this presentation is to talk a little bit about the trifecta, talk about options for graziers to improve land condition, and that's mainly talking about the basics of good grazing land management, talk a bit about some of the grazing systems work that has been done internationally, Queensland, Northern Territory, etc. I've got a couple of slides on carbon farming, and I really enjoyed the session there before lunch. Sources of information and a Q&A session hopefully at the end. So moving on to the beef industry trifecta, well, it's not rocket science. It's purely the coincidence of high beef prices, good seasonal conditions, and low interest rates. And I guess the beef industry trifecta probably peaked sometime in 2021, and the shine's come off it a bit at the moment because costs have definitely risen. So if you go out and see what's happened with the price of diesel, the price of steel, urea, and it doesn't matter whether you're in farming or feeding it to cattle that are doing it tough during the dry season, the price of land and what's happened to interest rates, things have definitely changed over the last 12 months and quite dramatically. However, the industry really is still in quite a good position, and I think that while we have these sorts of this alignment of these three attributes of industry, it's important that producers do take the opportunity to reevaluate where they are and see if there's any options to make improvements. So what are some of these options? I'm not going to go through them all. There's another presentation on the Future Beef website where I flesh each one of those out, but I'm not going to do that today. So producers may decide, well, business as usual, I'm happy, I'm comfortable, I'll stick with what I'm doing, and that's fair enough. But I think in any of those other 7 headings there are opportunities for significant change and significant improvement to be made. So I'm only going to talk about 2, and those 2 there. So the opportunities to increase long-term carrying capacity and the opportunities to improve environmental management on cattle properties. So I always go back to the fundamentals. So if we're looking at improving land condition, which is the prime way we can increase long-term carrying capacity, and it's one of the main spin-offs of getting land in better condition, that it is actually better environmental management by another name. The big gains are really to be made by addressing the fundamentals well. So the first one is to really have an understanding of one of the simplest concepts in the beef industry: what makes grass grow. And there's only 3 things that really determine for a piece of land how much pasture it produces. The type of country, which is a function primarily of soil fertility and soil depth. The condition of the country is it in good condition, or is it modestly degraded, or is it severely degraded? And the climatic zone you're in. In other words, how much rainfall you receive. So which one of those 3 do you think can be managed by someone that's managing a beef business? Sorry?
The middle one primarily.
Yes.
The land type what you buy.
That's right. That's right. you're spot on. Land condition really is only one that a manager can have some say over and some influence over what's happening with land condition. So that's the one that's got to be targeted. Now the next 7 points I'm going to make are aimed at things that can be done to improve the condition of the country. So the first one is simply, and it was talked about this morning by Joe and was it Anita? Yeah, from on a property down near Chinchilla. And they talked about this, matching stocking rates to carrying capacity. They had a slightly different term for it, but it was the same one and the same thing. So, and really it revolves around doing some sort of formalised or even a back of the envelope forage budget to ensure that by the end of the dry season, the paddocks that have been grazed for the dry season come into the following wet season in what we call rain-ready condition. In other words, they've got cover, they've got tussocks, they're going to have high infiltration rates, and there's going to be pasture production. You certainly need to know the green date, and we now talk about the production date, which is the green date plus 1 month. So if we do a forage budget, we usually recommend people or producers do their forage budget out to the production date. And the earlier in the dry season this forage budget is done, the better the system works. So if it's done somewhere around first round, and numbers are adjusted early, usually the adjustment in numbers is fairly modest. So I'll just demonstrate this with an example. So this is just a scenario on Mitchell Grass Downs country. We've got a paddock that's 2,000 hectares. We've had probably a bit below average season, and it's grown 1,600 kilos of feed. The safe utilisation rate for Mitchell Grass about 22%. So that means we've got, off each hectare, we've got 350 kilograms of feed available for grazing. There's 300 AEs that we can put into that paddock, and our forage budget's going to go through to the end of the calendar year. So we want to do a forage budget and work out of those 300 AEs, how many of them can we carry over for the rest of the dry season. So let's crunch some numbers. Now there's a lot of numbers there, and I don't expect you to go through the lot, but what I want you to concentrate on is the first column and the last column. So the first column is the date that adjustment in cattle numbers is made as you go into the dry season, and the last column is the percent reduction of the herd that you could have put in there that you actually put in there. So we had 300 AEs available. We did the forage budget and made the adjustment on the 1st of April. According to our forage budget, we need to reduce those numbers by 13%. Is that reasonably clear? And every month that we delay, so the 300 are in there and we delay it till say 1st of June, that means we're going to make a 16% reduction. So our paddock comes out of the end of the dry season in rain-ready condition for the next wet season. Now the reductions are fairly modest until you get down to about mid-dry season, say August, September, and you'll see that the percent reduction starts to increase quite dramatically. And so someone's desperate to get in. That's all right. So mid-dry season on, if people still haven't made the adjustment then, in other words, they're running a 300 AEs and they decide to make adjustment, the adjustments are very big. If you get to the end of the season, so 1st of April, numbers have got to be reduced by only 13%, so 97% of the cattle stay in. At the end of the dry season, you might say, well, the 1st of December, my forage budget's only for another month. How many cattle can I carry for that last month? The answer is practically none. So in other words, if you wanted to maintain that paddock in rain-ready condition for the end of the dry season and the start of the wet, it's a destock. Now, how many people are going to destock a paddock on the 1st of December when our forage budget date is the 1st of January? Probably nobody. So the cattle stay in. The rain's late. We don't get our green date until the 1st of February. What's happened to the paddock in the meantime? It's lost cover. We've got a lot of bare ground. So that's an example of a paddock that's in reasonably good rain-ready condition. It's got good tussocks, reasonable cover. The tussocks are a bit short, but they're still pretty good, and you'll get a good response when you get the next wet season rains. As opposed to a paddock like this, it's had a fairly long, it's been fairly heavily grazed over the dry season. Obviously, most probably no attempt to make a forage budget, so it's in pretty sad condition. Now, if that continues year in, year out, we start to deteriorate land conditions. We get into a C condition land, and eventually we'll start to get patches of D condition country. So that's the first one, is the forage budget. The next one is breeder herd efficiency, and you might think, where's this breeder herd efficiency come into a land management tool? But it is a very powerful land management tool. Best demonstrated by another example. So we'll take a larger paddock, 10,000 hectare paddock, and I want to look at two scenarios. So the first one, we've got a breeder herd in there. We're running 5% bulls. We've got 1,500 breeders, and they're producing 825 weaners each season on average. So it's a 55% weaning rate. If you tally up all the AEs, we've got a herd in that breeder paddock of about 1,900 AEs. So that stocking rate is 5.3 hectares per AE. For that land type, it's pretty heavy. Scenario 2, we've got 2% bulls. They're probably better bulls, paid a bit more for them. They've been vet checked before they go into the breeder herd. The breeders have been maybe in a controlled mating system or been preg tested into trimesters. And so we can do something with those breeders to maybe get rid of the empties right at the outset. And you'll notice that our weaning rate, has gone up dramatically to 75%. I mean, that's not going to happen in year one, but maybe over 6 or 7 years you probably could get there. The interesting thing, though, is to look at the size of that breeder herd now. It's 1,420 AEs, so the stocking rate is 25% lighter than scenario 1. Same number of weaners, much smaller herd. So which one of those scenarios is going to engender or allow for an improvement in land condition? You don't have to be Albert Einstein. It's clearly scenario 2. So that's where this has got a very strong relationship to getting on the track of improving land condition. Which leads nicely into the next one, targeted wet season spelling. It's very difficult to do targeted wet season spelling if the overall stocking rate of the property doesn't allow for the implementation of a wet season spelling program. And that previous example of the breeder herd gives you a way of if you've got 2 or 3 breeder paddocks on a big run, there's a chance in a better season that you could lock one of those paddocks up because there's a bit of wriggle room in the other 2 paddocks. So by doing a bit of mixing and matching, the overall stocking rate across the whole property enables a producer to get into a wet season spelling program where a paddock that needs a spell might get one every 3 or 4 years. If the season fails, it's not much point continuing with a spell. You may as well graze it and only spell when there's soil water. It's no good spelling dry paddocks that have got no available water in the soil. The only time you would spell a paddock in the dry season like that is if the cover's getting down and you've got a risk of going into the next dry season, into the next wet season with bare country. So planning for wet season spelling is crucial. So plan early, and it probably needs to be thought about back the previous year in the last round muster for that paddock. Are you going to put cattle back in there, or are you going to lock it up for the coming wet season? So they're decisions for a manager to make. The next one of these basics is oversown legumes. And there's a whole suite of legumes. I won't for any minute say that there's legumes for every part of northern Australia, but we have got a fairly wide suite of legumes. And there's chances are for a lot of situations we have legumes that are suitable for various soil types or various climatic zones, so they're worth checking out. For special use paddocks, there can be quite a good opportunity to actually put in a complete replacement pasture, so replace the whole pasture with sown legumes and sown grasses. But oversowing with legumes in a native pastures is probably economically one of the best things that producers can do. I won't say that it's always easy to crack it and get them established, but if you can, it's highly lucrative. The next one is fire. So fire is dropping out of Northern Australian grazing management, particularly in Queensland, less so in the Northern Territory. So fire is not the cure for all problems, but if there's an opportunity to manipulate pasture composition, as in trying to check wiregrass or promote things like black speargrass, fire can play a role. Fire can create quite a good ash seedbed for things like stylos. Quite a few of our serious woody weeds, I'm thinking rubber vine, ballyache bush, Parkinsonia to a certain degree, lantana to a certain degree closer to the coast, are quite susceptible to fire. A lot of areas got problems with currant bush and other woodland thickening species. Fire won't kill much, but it will check things and will suppress things, so it can play a role in managing woodland thickening. The crucial thing with fire, though, is pre-planning, so planning before the burn. So if you use a forage budget, you may well get some grazing in that paddock, but pull the cattle out so you've got the amount of fuel you require for the type of fire that you need. If you're not doing a forage budget, you might just say, well, I'll spell that paddock, I won't graze it for the year. That could be grazing forgone that you could have made some use of and still had an adequate fuel load. And at the other end with fire, after the fire, really country that gets burnt needs a full wet season spell to fully recover. Control weeds early. And once again, I'll show this by example as well. This is prickly acacia in Western Queensland. Tropical Weeds Research Centre have done some great work in Charters Towers. This is some of their work. They found if you had a 30% canopy cover of prickly acacia, that equates to a 50% loss in grass yield. In other words, you're losing or foregoing approximately 1,000 kilos of pasture per year for a 75 kilo of browse from prickly acacia foliage at the other side. I mean, it's high protein, but it doesn't make up for 1,000 kilos of grass, I assure you. If the canopy cover of that same prickly acacia goes up to 50%, the pasture loss is 75%. I mean, these are dramatic figures. And this is the sort of stuff that I think can motivate landholders to maybe look a bit more seriously at some of these big weed problems. And some of the NRM groups in Western Queensland are doing a good job in managing prickly acacia, but boy, have they got a problem. It's huge. With weeds, developing a weed management plan is crucial, and start with the lightest infestations first and work your way to the more dense ones, but crucially, follow up as you go. There's an inordinate amount of material out there, case studies, information on individual weeds. There's no shortage of information. It's implementation and it's putting into a planning context so people can actually implement it. And the last one of the basics is what I've called site-specific erosion control or land reclamation activities. And so if you can select sites with the highest return for the lowest cost spent, they're the ones to start with, obviously, because they may not have a positive cost-benefit ratio, but they'll be the ones that are closest to it. Because some things have got no benefit at all as far as production. They might have a significant environmental benefit, and if that's the case, go and see what your local NRM group can offer. But it's important with reclaiming degraded land and also with controlling and managing weeds that you ensure that the paddock and the property management supports the gains from the land reclamation. Because if the management doesn't change that caused the problem, what you fixed up over time will revert back to its previous degraded state. So there's got to be management changes go along with reclamation and weed control. So as I say, those last 8 points, that's where the big gains are to be made. They are the basics. Now there's a lot of information around about grazing systems. Unfortunately, we've got a lot of good research work has been done on it, and it's still ongoing. So I'm going to talk about grazing systems, and I'm going to talk about at an international context based on a review paper, a couple of state or territory type studies, and wrap up with that. So this is a paper that was written in 2008. It's by David Brisky. Some people may have met David. He comes out here occasionally. He's a professor of range science at Texas A&M University in the United States. He's a very good scientist. He did a review paper in 2008. He looked at 47 trials, and these were scientifically conducted, scientifically designed, and they were published in externally refereed journals. The studies went right back to 1951, and you can see the countries they covered, primarily North America, a couple in South America, and a few in Africa. You'll note there's no Australian studies there. Just so to present some of the results, but before I do, he split them all into rotational grazing and continuous grazing. Now, in his interpretation of rotational grazing, it also included things like cell grazing, time control grazing, those intensive grazing systems, in other words. So what were his findings? The first one is to do with plant production. It was equal or greater in continuous compared to rotational grazing systems in 87% of the experiments or the trials that he reviewed. For animal production, both in terms of per head production and per unit area production, were equal or greater in continuous compared to rotational grazing in 92% and 84% respectively of the experiments that he reviewed. And his last conclusion or finding was that these experimental data demonstrate that a set of potentially effective grazing strategies exist, none of which have unique properties that set one apart from the other in terms of their, ecological effectiveness. So they're fairly powerful conclusions, and like I say, they're based on good science. There's no Australian data there, so let's look at some. So this is a study that was funded by Meat and Livestock Australia, headed up by Trevor Hall and a group of other DPI, DAF scientists and CSIRO scientists, and it looked at grazing systems. In this case, though, they took a different approach. They didn't do looking at trials. They didn't set up another trial. They actually did a whole of property assessment. So 9 properties were selected that had intensive grazing systems on them, as well as other grazing systems. 3 of these properties are in the Brigalow Belt, so primarily buffel country. 3 were in the Eucalypt country and 3 were on the Downs. Now the properties were well established and well run properties, so they weren't properties that were just getting into developing or implementing a new grazing system. They'd been in it for a while and they knew what they were doing. And they had to have had at least 2 grazing systems operating on each property, so either continuous grazing, rotational grazing or cell grazing. Over the 4 years that assessment was done, 74 paddocks were monitored, and fortunately in those 4 years they had 2 drought years and 2 average years, which is good because you get 4 really good years or 4 really crook years. You're not sure whether it's a seasonal effect or a management effect, but when you get a range of years, you can pretty well say they're more management effects that are reflected in the results. So what are the findings? In pastures, diet quality was lower by 2% crude protein in the intensive systems during the growing season, but no difference in the dry season. And this is some of the dung analysis data. So if you look at the crude protein contents there for cell grazing, it's about 7.4%, increasing to nearly 8.5% for continuous. And you look at the live weight gains interpreted from this data, 0.6 of a kilo per head per day for cells and nearly 0.7 for continuous grazing. Pretty powerful information. The soils, little or no difference in soil surface condition and cover, no difference in trees and shrub density. Land condition, no differences in 3 out of 4 of the years, but a lower percentage of the land in A condition in continuous grazing systems was noted in 1 year. Uniformity of grazing, not surprising. Under cell grazing, it's a very uniformly grazed system. The costs. So what they did is they rolled capital costs, operating costs and management inputs into what they called a grazing systems intensity index. And there's the data. So for cell grazing, it's quite high at 79, rotational 61, continuous 26. So obviously the continuous one is much cheaper to establish and to operate. Carrying capacity, there's no significant difference between the carrying capacity of the land under the cell grazing system compared to continuous grazing. The rotational was back a bit, but there was some data missing from the rotational one, so I'd probably take that result with a grain of salt. But certainly between continuous and cell grazing, no significant difference in carrying capacity. The financial implications, they really couldn't be determined. And when you look at the way these properties were run, and they were well-managed properties, it's not surprising because the grazing systems evolved and changed, and all thinking producers don't do the same thing year in, year out. They refine systems, and that's exactly what happened here. And the other complicating factor that made it difficult to work out the financial implications was that cattle moved between systems. So calves might have been born in one system, the weaners went into another system, the growing cattle, the finishing cattle went into a third system. So the financial implications couldn't be determined because cattle were moving between systems. The other points, seasonal conditions had a bigger influence in the grazing system. All systems were well managed, I've already stated that. All systems, including the continuous system, did have some pasture rest. In other words, the continuous grazed paddocks were wet season spelled occasionally. I'm not too sure, Dave, how many years out of 3 or 4? Yeah, once every 3. Well, Dave was one of the co-authors on this paper. at all properties, multiple grazing systems were integrated and managed flexibly. In other words, they didn't have predefined recipes or systems. And interestingly, improvements in pasture resource and whole beef businesses under intensive grazing systems was due to constant monitoring of cattle and pastures rather than the grazing system per se. So it was more the benefit of monitoring rather than the actual grazing system itself. And the conclusion from this work was the grazing system or method was relatively unimportant. A more intensive grazing system is one way of achieving benefits, but simpler and less expensive management systems will achieve similar outcomes. So that's Queensland. The last bit of work I want to report on is work done in the Northern Territory by Tim Schatz, Northern Territory DPI, done at Douglas Dahlia Research Farm, where he looked at buffalo grass pastures running steers under different grazing systems. So compared high intensity rotational grazing versus continuous grazing. The trial ran for 9 years. Higher rainfall country than a lot of those sites that were mentioned in that Queensland study. Fortunately, over the 9 years, they also had a spread of different years, so 3 years below average, 1 year around the average, and 5 years above. So the stocking rates are quite heavy because it's high rainfall country and 100% buffalo pastures or near enough to it. So the intensive rotational grazing, 1.3 hectares per head. Continuous graze with a variable rate, depending on the season, varied between 1.3 and 1.8 hectares per head, and the continuous graze constant was a bit heavier at 0.7 hectares per head. The continuous graze constant was only implemented for 6 years, and I'll explain why it was taken out in a little while. But the paddocks that were in that treatment for the last 3 years were actually added into the intensive rotational graze system. And just on the intensive rotational grazing system, cattle moved to a new paddock. You can see the times of year there and the length of each graze at that time of year and the corresponding rest periods between each graze. So the results. So years 1 to 6, first of all looking at individual animal performance, kilograms per head per year. So for the continuous graze variable, 153 kgs per head, and the continuous graze constant was about the same. The intensive rotational graze, 126 kilos a head, which was 27 kilos behind the continuous graze variable. On an area basis, similar results. So the intensive rotational graze was 30 kilograms per hectare behind the other systems. And you can see the similarities between the continuous graze variable and the continuous graze constant. I mean, they're almost identical figures. So there's no significant difference there. In an effort to try and give the intensive rotational grazing system a bit more of a kick along, all the paddocks that were in that continuous graze constant treatment were taken out of that treatment and put into the intensive rotational grazing system to enable longer rest periods between grazing. So that leads us on to the results for the final 3 years of the trial. So years 7 to 9. On an individual animal basis, the premium for the continuous graze system even got higher. So there was a bigger spread or bigger difference between intensive and continuous graze, 44 kilograms. That should be per head, sorry, not per hectare. That's a typo there. My typo, not the trial. And on an area basis, it's 67 kilos per hectare premium for the continuous graze treatment. So the conclusion, and this is not the conclusion in the paper, this is the conclusion that I've drawn, changes as a result of changing grazing systems are modest at best. Get the basics right first. Once you get the basics right, then you can start to muck around with things like the, looking at the grazing system a bit more critically. But the big gains are not to be made by changing the grazing system.
Just so I get that right, in the rotational grazing one, they actually extended the rest period between grazing.
Mm-hmm.
Wouldn't they have been better off going the opposite way?
They also wanted to keep the stocking rate. Well, the stocking rate range in there is quite high, from 1.3 hectares per head to 1.8, which is heavier. So to keep the integrity of the trial going, they thought, well, it's not getting enough rest between periods, between grazes.
But if you've got a buffalo graze, you're going to end up if you take it out to 60, take it from 60 to 80 days,
Yeah.
ahead, you end up with a cellular plant.
I-
It's done the opposite way.
I think it depends on the time of year when the moves are made and just how fast the moves are made. So in the growing season, I'd agree with you. In the dry season, I don't think it makes much difference because there's no growth. Yeah. I'd have to go back to the paper, Ross, and see what the actual graze periods was once they brought those more paddocks in to extend the rest period out.
I think I've read the paper as
Yep.
well. That was one of the things that I would question.
Yeah, okay.
Because, you know, it's, if we got prime pasture, we should be, if you're in a
Yeah.
grazing or an intensive grazing system,
Yeah,
you're harvesting that leaf and moving
Yeah.
as quickly as possible rather than letting it go through
Yeah.
your fertility, which
Yeah.
is the way to be.
So the graze at the height of the wet season was the fastest move in the whole trial. So they did, you know, it was, I think it was only a 1 day graze. Yeah, but then the rest period. Yeah. I just want to move on to carbon, and I really enjoyed Melanie and Cam's session this morning. So when we're talking about carbon, we're talking about carbon that's either in woody vegetation or carbon that's in soil. So just looking at the vegetation to start with, so here's a photograph of a nice open savanna. And if by exclusion of fire or heavy grazing, we get a crop of suckers come up, if things stay the same and these suckers get up and become saplings, they've escaped the fire trap, and that's what we call woodland thickening or bush encroachment, as they call it in New South Wales. The thing is, we can assess that at a property scale. So this is some work that was done by Department of Environment Science about 12 years ago. They looked at Hillgrove Station, north of Charters Towers, and they measured the percent annual change in persistent green, which is a surrogate for tree density, over 23 years from 87 to 2010. But they did some very snazzy science, and they could actually take account of the rainfall signature and how rainfall affected canopy cover to actually get at the true tree basal area change underneath. I'm not sure how they did that, but I know in that group they've got some very good scientists. You look at the map and you can see the blue areas, so they've increased, where are we? 2% per annum in tree density. Down the bottom, the red areas are decreased by 2%, and the yellow stuff in the middle is no change. So you look at the map and get an idea. There's more country that has thickened than there is country that's thinned. There's still a lot of country that hasn't changed. But if we just look at a 1% increase per annum figure, if we compound that for 25 years, that's a 30% increase in tree density, which has a major impact on carrying capacity. We can even go one scale up more, a broader scale, and look at a catchment. So here's the Burdekin Basin. Work done by DPI Rockhampton, Bill Burrows, Steve Bray, others. And they looked at the carbon signature that grasses put into the soil versus the carbon signature that trees put into the soil. In other words, they're measuring a ratio of carbon isotopes. And from that, they can infer changes in the balance between trees and grasses. And I don't know whether you can see that map. It's got a grey behind it and it's got white. So the grey is remnant vegetation, the white is country that's been cleared. Now this work was done on randomly selected sites in the remnant vegetation. So we're not talking cleared country, we're talking stuff that's never been cleared. And these are results. So 6% of those sites had thinned out, 30% were unchanged, 64% had thickened. And I would hazard to say that across Northern Australia, that similar trend to a greater or lesser degree is what's happening. It's a big concern. It's even more concern when we look at that real effect of pasture production as trees get thicker. It really amplifies on low fertility soils. So if we look at two scenarios here, if we look at this scenario here, that's pasture yield on the y-axis, tree density on the x-axis. On a blue gum flat, which is a high fertility land type, high producing, good moisture relationships in the soil. As the tree density gets thicker, of course, the yield goes down. On low fertility land types, the same thing happens, but it happens to a much greater extent. So the utilisation rate on blue gum country is about 30%. So what we're saying is, in this scenario, the area we've got to do our forage budget in is the band between the dashed blue line and the solid blue line. We can do the same for the narrowleaf ironbark country. So the area we've got to work with for a forage budget, for example, is the area between the dash green line and the solid green line, a lot less. So 0 tree basal area is cleared, 5 is still reasonably open, 10 is quite thickened, and 25 is a jungle or forest. But what happens with the thing is, we've also got to take account of how much residual we want at the end of the dry season, which we work on as about 800 kilograms per hectare, so that's the red line. So what are the stocking rates on the high fertility land type? So when it's cleared, it's 3 hectares, 5 is 4 hectares per AE, 5 hectares per AE, and right out at quite a dense forest, still 10 hectares per AE, so there's still some grazing. But on the low fertility one, when it's cleared, it's 6. When it's got 5 square metres per hectare tree density, the stocking rates or the carrying capacity is back to 10 hectares per AE. When it's thickened to about 12, most years there's no carrying capacity there because all we're growing is our residual, which we need to maintain function in the landscape. That's my utilisation rate line, but it's 30% below the peak yield. Yes, so if I can get this pointer to work again, that's the 30% yield in there. For the blue gum country, this is the 30% yield, 25% yield because it's a lower fertility land type for the narrowleaf ironbark between the dashed line and the solid line. So that's the grazing that's available. But we've got to pull the residual off. We've got to allow for the residual. So what I'm saying is, as the country thickens, it's not having a big effect on, well, it is having a big effect, but proportionally it's not having as big effect on the high fertility land type than it is on these low fertility land types. So what we deduce from that is that woodland thickening does equal more stored carbon in the landscape. It also means a reduced long-term carrying capacity of the country, and that's the trade-off. Looking at the soil carbon, soil health is very important, but will soil organic carbon persist? And this was talked about a little bit this morning. So what does the science say? The West Australians put out a report last year on soil carbon in soils, obviously soil carbon in soils, soil carbon, and they looked at the rangeland areas of WA, and these were their conclusions. Soil organic carbon levels in West Australian rangelands are low by global standards, even in the higher rainfall areas. Rainfall has very little influence on soil organic carbon where average annual maximum temperatures exceed 24 degrees, which covers pretty well the whole of the rangelands in WA. Forecast increases, and this is due to climate change, and temperature across the rangelands are likely to decrease potential soil organic carbon levels. On the other side, forecast increases in rainfall are unlikely to significantly increase soil organic carbon potential levels. I picked that because Western Australia has a similar climatic range to Queensland, at least for the northern 2/3 of it, and to a certain degree it has similar soil types as well. A lot of clay country in the north and in the Kimberley, into lighter textured soils as you go down the coast or down through the centre. In Queensland grazing lands, this was a study that was done in 2013, where they looked at a broad area of Queensland. They sampled 98 sites on 18 properties, measuring soil organic carbon levels, and what they found was, and this is not surprising, soil organic carbon declined with reduced pasture yield and increased stocking rates. I mean, we probably all knew that anyway. The interesting thing was they also did a bit of a comparison of what was happening with the underlying grazing system, and they said that cell grazing had a slightly but significantly reduced soil organic carbon stocks compared with the continuous grazing or where cattle had been excluded. Fairly interesting stuff. There's a trend in the United States for what we call carbon ranching. Wow, 2 minutes. What they found was, and they looked at a whole stack of trials that were used to make this evaluation, including 2 from Queensland. They basically found that a lot of the science that was analysed and presented for this carbon ranching proposal or concept was quite flawed. So I'll leave you to read it when you get a copy of the application. So the conclusions from all that stuff on carbon is that for vegetation carbon, assess the possible changes in long-term carrying capacity before you commit to, and it was talked about this morning, about committing to actually selling credits. And for soil carbon, you've heard of caveat emptor, buyer beware. I think it's caveat vendita, seller beware. Make sure that right after you're selling soil carbon credits, that when it comes to the crunch towards 25 years' time, that they're still actually there and they haven't vaporised and you've got to buy them back. I've covered a lot there, I realise, and I've whizzed through it, but hopefully it's given a bit of food for thought, and also something that you can talk to producers when you go out into properties. So thanks very much. Questions?